Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Sunday edition of the Nigel Farage Show. As Westminster is gripped in what is undoubtedly the worst crisis to have hit British politics since the expenses scandal, and with every day that goes by, somebody new is suspended, has the whip withdrawn, whether it's from the Labour Party or the Conservative Party, indeed some problems north of the border in the Scottish Parliament too. And I'm just wondering, what is our confidence in Parliament like, our belief in our political system? And I say this 500 days on from the referendum, when we voted for a fundamental change that doesn't appear to be happening. I've got a feeling that our trust in politicians, in the political system, in our ability to change things, is probably this morning about as low as it's ever been. Very interesting comment by Gary Streeter, Conservative MP. He's represented the Plymouth area since 1992. And he said on Twitter this week, it feels increasingly like the 1992 to 97 Parliament. No majority, no money, ripping ourselves apart over the European Union. That lasted 5 years. Oh dear. And I think there is a feeling, and you've got to be, obviously, getting on in years to remember the Back to Basics campaign that was launched by John Major that led to, a flurry of allegations of sexual impropriety, some ultimately that involved the Prime Minister, John Major, himself. But there is a problem. Our trust in politics is on the floor. Take the Veracity Index that is put out every year that tells us who do we trust in the world, and unsurprisingly we have great faith in the medical profession and teachers, etc. But who are the 5 least trusted professions in Britain today? Well, our big business leaders, only 33% of you trust them and think they tell the truth. Estate agents, well, they're there at 30%. Journalists are there at 24%. Government ministers, 20%. And politicians generally, 15%. 85% of you listening to this programme do not trust politicians, and I would argue probably, by extension, politics at all. We have a major problem. I want to debate that, but first, let's get back to the Westminster sex scandal. I'm going to go to Theo Usherwood, LBC's political editor. Theo, they appear to be dropping like flies.
Damien Green, Nigel, is back in the headlines this morning. Of course, he faced allegations, which he strenuously denied during the week, from the writer and his family friend Kate Maltby, that he fleetingly touched her knee in a taxi and then sent her a suggestive text message. Now, Damien Green is back in the headlines today after allegations that extreme pornography was found on his computer. Now, this allegation dates back to 2008, when the police were investigating a government leak in Parliament. They seized Mr. Green's computers. There was a big furore around it at the time because they didn't inform the Speaker and the House authorities that they were going to do this. And now the allegation is coming from a former Assistant Met Commissioner called Bob Quick. And Mr. Green, for his part, has said that Mr. Quick is running a sort of smear campaign, political smear campaign against him. But one of the key parts of this, Nigel, is that Mr. Quick is going to be giving evidence to a lady called Sue Gray tomorrow, and she's running the Cabinet Office inquiry. She's a Whitehall ethics supremo, and she's going to be taking evidence from Mr. Quick. Now, off the record, speaking to people around Damien Green, and this relates to the Kate Maltby allegations, they insist that there is they have strong evidence which actually, in part, they would claim completely undoes the allegation by Miss Maltby. But this is the key allegation, if you like, Nigel, because she is the de facto Deputy Prime Minister. This
meeting, this investigation that Sue Gray, senior civil servant, is holding, is a private, not a public event, yeah?
Yeah, it's a private event, absolutely.
So what is a former Metropolitan Police officer who was involved in, a very, very important inquiry into government leaks, what is he doing talking to the newspapers about it?
Well, that would have to be a question for Mr. Quick, but it is something that you raise because also, it's quite right to raise it because also Kate Maltby, who did an interview in the Sunday Times today, will also be speaking to Sue Gray ahead of that investigation when it starts tomorrow. The only other minister that's in subject to that, by the way, at the moment is Mark Garnier. He's the trade minister, and of course he was the first one, if you like, to face these to be named in these allegations. Incidentally, Daniel Poulter, former health minister, he's been reported to the Disciplinary Procedure Committee, which is a new committee set up as a result of these allegations by Andrew Bridgen, one of his own side, amid allegations that Mr. Bridgen reported to the whips that Daniel Poulter had behaved inappropriately. And then another embarrassing story for the government, Chris Pincher. He's a senior government whip. He is facing allegations, Nigel, that he invited back a former Tory aide, former Olympic rower called Alex Story to his house and behaved like a pound shop Harvey Weinstein in his bathrobe and made suggestive comments.
Yeah, I mean, Theo, clearly there's a mixture of things here. But on the one hand, you've got allegations of people really behaving badly, grabbing, groping, abusing their positions. And on the other, we seem to have allegations that someone's hand might have brushed across someone's knee in a bar. Aren't we in danger here of some of the more trivial incidents actually masking what overall could be some very serious abuse that's going on?
Well, you're quite right to say that, Nigel. On that list of 40 MPs that was circulating last week, there was everything from perfectly consensual affairs. Now, of course, most of us would agree that, that's an immoral thing to do, is to have an affair behind your wife or husband's back, but it's not illegal. That's the key part, and yet that's mixed in, as you say, with perhaps some comments that could have been taken out of hand, and then mixed in with some really serious stuff. And it's become very difficult to pick out what's what and what falls into which bracket. And people have been caught up. Rory Stewart, for instance, faced allegations that he behaved inappropriately towards a female researcher. That female researcher actually went on the record and said completely untrue. When she worked for Rory Stewart, he behaved in a professional manner throughout, and that she found the allegations deeply disturbing. So actually what is also mixed into this story are complete falsehoods, things that are libelous, that are wrong, but it's very difficult to see, for the general public to see what is actually what's what, and then of course that just undermines public trust all the more.
For the public to see through that. Also tough for the public because actually nearly all of the names that you've mentioned this morning, the general public have never ever heard of them. They've literally never heard of them. And given that in the modern world, increasingly people meet their partners through the workplace, either directly or indirectly, I'm not quite sure what some of these messages are. I'm worried, Theo, that we're going to concern ourselves with people making passes at each other rather than serious sexual assault. And I'm not quite sure where this ends. Is your guess that as the weeks go by, more and more names come out?
I think the most important thing to look at from a political point of view is who survives. Does Damien Green survive? Because if Damien Green goes, that is the Prime Minister's closest friend, confidant within the Cabinet. They went to university together. He's a de facto Deputy Prime Minister, key position. He is under increasing pressure now, irrespective of whether the allegations are right or are correct or incorrect. And that's where, in Westminster, politically speaking, we'll be looking to see whether Mr. Green can hold on. Because if Mr. Green goes, this government is in jeopardy.
Theo Usherwood, LBC's political editor, thank you for that update on where we are. Well, Theo making the point that if the Deputy PM goes, the government perhaps is in real trouble. But it isn't just sex allegations, is it? You know, we had the expenses scandal where I think members of the public thought that MPs were putting in claims for all sorts of frivolous things that, frankly, the public should not be picking up the purse for. But it's also, I have to say, and I'm going to say this as a leaver, 500 days after that vote, we're still in the European Union, we're still paying money. There's no great prospect at the moment for us actually leaving, given the government wants a transition period. There are millions of Labour voters who voted leave, who thought in the manifesto a few months ago that Corbyn still supported that. He's now decided to turn the party's view around. I think there is a problem. I mean, how do we change things? How do we change things with our current political system? I think it needs a complete overhaul. I think we need to have recall, where we have the ability to call a member of parliament that's sitting to a by-election because we're unhappy with their behaviour. I think we need a different electoral system whereby the big parties don't dominate and we don't finish up with MPs from both parties who are really very similar to each other. I think we need an element of proportional representation, and we need, as the Americans do, open primaries so the people can pick candidates, not the central parties in Westminster, who frankly have too much power over all of this system. They're my thoughts for what needs changing. But tell me, what's the one reform that you think should be made to our political system? Call me on 0345 6060 973. Text me at 84850. You can tweet on @LBC using the hashtag Farage at LBC. And of course, if you're watching on Facebook, you can also comment there too. You're listening to the Sunday edition of the Nigel Farage Show, exclusively on LBC, and it's 10:15. Our confidence in politics and politicians is at rock bottom, and it isn't just this sex scandal that's breaking. It isn't just the expenses scandal that we had a few years ago. I believe it's our powerlessness to do anything, to change anything. Let me give you an example, a specific example of why I think people are feeling pretty hacked off with politics and politicians. Let's take the constituency of Huddersfield in the borough of Kirklees, up there in Yorkshire. Barry Shearman is the Labour MP. He's been their MP since 1979. He's got a very, very safe seat. And you may well have been a loyal Barry Shearman voter throughout many of those years. Last week, he caused a bit of a storm. He talked about the low educational attainment of Brexit supporters. Basically, if you voted Brexit, you're pretty stupid. And he cited the university towns who all voted Remain. You remember the ones I talked about last week that receive hundreds of millions of pounds directly from the European Union. But Barry Shearman said that as a representative of a constituency where 55% of people voted in that referendum to leave the European Union. 1 week on, far from being repentant in any way about what he said about the majority of his own constituents and voters. No, a week on, he said, unfortunately, many of the protests I've received from Brexit supporters are so illiterate that it's impossible to read them and know what they are trying to say. Now, you know, if I'm a Leave voter living in Huddersfield, and particularly if I'm a Labour Leave voter living in Huddersfield, that is going to make my blood boil. I've just been insulted by the town's MP. And yet, what can I do to change it? Nothing. Nothing. I'm not going to get the Labour Party to deselect someone that's been there since 1979. I've got no power at all. And this, to me, is a classic example of where a different political system might help us. If we had the right of recall, if 20% of us in a constituency signed an attested petition demanding a by-election, we should be able to have one. Many parts of the USA have this system. Time and again in David Cameron's years, he talked about the prospect of bringing this in and never did anything about it. I'm going to put on the table, you know, as my first big pitch this morning as to how we might restore faith in politics and make us as voters feel that actually we're in charge, because we should be folk, shouldn't we? They're supposed to work for us, not the other way around. We should have the right of recall, and certainly if I was living in Huddersfield as a Labour Leave voter, I'd be signing that petition this morning. And by the way, Barry Shearman, if you're listening, do call 0345 6060 973 and tell me I've got it wrong. Tell me your own voters have got it wrong. I'm going to go to Stuart in Kensington for my first big suggestion of the morning. Stuart, hello.
Hello, Nigel. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
For me, this is a grave concern, and I see the problem at the centre of the hub is that it lacks integrity. And without integrity, nothing works. It simply spreads down the spokes and pollutes the consciousness of the whole. Now, these people, if we look at the bottom line, are trustees of an estate in office.
Yep.
We are the electorate, the grantors of that said trust.
We should be the bosses, Stuart, yeah?
Yeah. For and on our behalf as beneficiaries. Now, it's a fundamental fact that if a trustee is in breach of duty of office, he must resign office.
Mm-hmm.
Now, they go into office and they swear an oath, and then they think they assume the audacity that they can override the oath of office. And you've only got to look at, for example, the Act of Succession that states you cannot bind your successors, thereby technically invalidating Maastricht and the Lisbon Treaty.
Yeah, I mean, Stuart, this was the Tony Benn argument, wasn't it? Tony Benn made this argument for decades. He said that actually the European Communities Act 1972 went against the British Constitution because no parliament can be bound by a previous one. I understand that, but we have now voted to leave, Stuart, so we should, if that will gets carried out, we should be back to a sovereign parliament, shouldn't we?
Well, hopefully, yes, rather than being run by an executive. The way I see it, what's going on, in fact, if you see the undercurrent on a metaphysical level, what we've got going on is El Mundi, the underworld in the shape of corporate fiction, attempting to control the living souls. And, of course, there is an agenda to take global control of the financial markets, and, of course, this puts the spoke in it.
So what can the voter do, Stuart? What can we as voters do? Because we're feeling helpless, aren't we?
OK, well, given we're moving into this world of equality, and they all speak of equality, now, is that on proportional representation or is it not?
Well,
if it is, then there's a possibility that we could set up a parliament whereby we have 50% females, 50% males. A male runs the females, and a female runs the males.
Well, that would be quotas, Stuart, as opposed to PR. But look, you've given us a couple of ideas there to talk about, and one or two others agree. I get on Twitter, proportional representation, and make everyone vote is one suggestion. Peggy is calling from Basildon. Peggy, good morning.
Good morning, Nigel. I'd love to see the House of Lords done away with.
Peggy, come on. Well, you're being really mean. Don't you realise that House of Lords car park and dining room every day is packed full of David Cameron and Tony Blair's chums? Do you want to spoil their lifestyle?
Yes, I do. Absolutely. The oldest expensive care home in the country. We must be the laughing stock of the world if anyone looks at it.
Do you know, the other day, Peggy, I was on Eurostar coming back from Brussels, and there was a member of the House of Lords, and I won't name him, it's not fair, but there was a member of the House of Lords on the train. And I asked him, I said, well, how's it going? Because he's been in the Lords a couple of years. He said, it's the best old people's home in London. It's exactly what he said to me. He said, we get a subsidised lunch and the drinks aren't expensive, and they get paid a few £100 for turning up every day, don't they?
Absolutely. And they have the cheek to make laws where they earn more in one day with expenses. You know, they don't pay no tax on the expenses, and what they make laws for people don't even earn that in a week, which is outrageous.
Peggy, we need an upper house to review legislation. I've always thought that. And the idea that you have an upper house of more experienced people from a wide range of backgrounds in life, and hopefully from a wide geography across the United Kingdom, is something I've always supported. I'm now struck, Peggy, that Blair and Cameron's announcements have just filled the House of Lords up with Londoners, all of whom have pretty much the same point of view. I don't think the rest of the country is now represented in the House of Lords. Ironically, it was better represented with the hereditaries because they came from right across the country. So, Peggy, I think getting rid of the House of Lords, I think now the public's ready for it. I think it's been discredited. What would you put in its place, Peggy?
Well, I would have, first of all, I would make a constitution and have people that were elected from general the general public, and I'd make them sign this constitution that they put the country first, not their parties. Because this is where we keep going wrong. They put their parties before this country. And I have Brexit. Will we ever come out of Brexit? It's a joke. Because half of them in Parliament are Remainers.
No, Peggy. No. You've got that wrong. I'm sorry, Peggy and Basildon, but you really have got that fundamentally wrong. Half of them in Parliament aren't Remainers. Over 70% of them are Remainers. And in the House of Lords, I think it's probably over 80%. So, we do have a system that is very out of touch with us. Peggy, I thank you. One of the ideas about reinvigorating politics has been to reduce the voting age to 16. And this was being discussed in Westminster on Friday. Is that a way, perhaps, of engaging more people? Ben on Facebook takes a very different view. He says 30 years old minimum age of voting, adults only. Ben, I don't think you're onto a winner with that. I've personally never been convinced of the idea that we should reduce the voting age to 16. I don't think you should be able to vote in an election unless you're able to be a candidate in that election. I think that makes sense all round. And do we actually think that 16-year-olds should be able to become members of Parliament? I personally don't. So I don't support that change. Ruth is calling from Northallerton. Ruth, give me one big idea to restore faith in politics.
Well, it's a bit of a tall order, isn't it?
It is.
Lovely to talk to you, Nigel.
Good morning.
I've been a fan of yours for years. And what I think we need to tighten up on the qualifications for being on the electoral roll, because you've got these rotten boroughs like Tower Hamlets and places where people come from the far corners of the globe and suddenly they're entitled to vote here, even if they can't speak the language and they don't know what they're voting for. And also, I do think we should have some sort of proportional representation, because like where I live in Northallerton, if you were to be a Labour or a UKIP supporter, you're not going to ever get an MP into Parliament to represent you. And the same if you're a Conservative voter in Barry Shearman's constituency. I think, I think you could tie a red ribbon round Huddersfield, Halifax, wherever Barry Shear comes from, and they'd vote for it.
So some form of PR.
The old bicycle with a blue ribbon on it, and they all vote for it. So,
Ruth, I absolutely agree with you. I think you're right. And in a moment, I'm going to explain the voting system that I think would be the best and the fairest, would keep the link between the member and the constituency, but give all of us, regardless of where we live, the chance to vote on something where we felt it would not be wasted. You're listening to the Sunday edition of the Nigel Farage Show, exclusively on LBC. It's 10:30. We've had enough of politics and politicians. The whole thing's at rock bottom, and Bill on Facebook sort of agrees with me. He says, yes, you're right. It's at rock bottom, and it's all your blooming fault. If you'd kept your mouth shut, we'd be fine. No Brexit, and we'd be working with the EU to change for the better. Really, Bill? Well, I'll tell you what, Bill, we've been trying to change the EU for 40 years and failing to do so. One of the reasons people voted Brexit. But actually, if you really want to become disenchanted with politics, look at the Greeks. Don't matter who they vote for as part of the euro, doesn't matter whether their government's on the left or on the right, everything from their tax rates to what they can spend on the hospitals is decided by the European Union, the IMF and other institutions. And really, Bill, the point of Brexit, the ultimate point of Brexit, is that we will in the future be voting for people directly in charge of making our laws. And in the last few years, the majority of our laws have not been made by people we vote for in Westminster. They've come from the EU. So we want, all of us on the Brexit side, want democracy to be reinvigorated. The real question I'm asking this morning is whether, given our current system, given the voting system, given the fact we haven't got recall, given the fact the House of Lords still has as much power as it has, given the abuses within the postal voting system, given the structure we've got, whether we can actually get to the vibrant democracy that we need, where voters feel properly in control. Andy says voting reform is definitely needed. At the last election, we had a whole new industry of tactical voting. Well, Andy, it wasn't just tactical voting. A lot of it's negative voting. Oh, I'm going to vote for this big party because I hate the other big party even more. Millions of people are voting on that basis under our first-past-the-post system rather than voting for what they believe in. Now, I've always been told first-past-the-post is the right system because it guarantees majority government and not coalitions. Well, didn't work out that way in 2010, did it? And it didn't work out that way in 2017. So we're living effectively with coalition government or confidence and supply government anyway. The voting system, Ruth, who was speaking to me before the break, the voting system that I think would work best is called AV+. It was the one that the late Lord Jenkins, Roy Jenkins, came up with when Blair tasked him to look at the electoral system, to make it more relevant to people. AV Plus means you would get, when you go into the polling station, 2 ballot papers, okay? One, you'd vote for the man or woman to represent your town or part of the city in which you live. And with the second ballot paper, you'd vote for a party or an opinion that you liked the most. All right? Now, you may well vote... you may well vote Labour on one and Green on the other. Or you may well vote Conservative on one and UKIP on the other. Or UKIP on one and Labour on the other. Or whatever permutation you wish. But the point is, let's say you're a high Tory living in Barry Shearman's Huddersfield constituency. You know the Tories have got no chance of winning that seat, and you might think, do you know what, it's Thursday, it's 7 o'clock, I've had a tough day at work, it's raining, I simply can't be bothered to walk down to the local primary school knowing my vote counts for nothing. With AV+, your second vote would go onto a national tally for the Tories, and about 20% of seats in Parliament would be divvied up on that basis. We're already using a variance of that for the London Assembly, the Scottish Parliament, the Welsh Assembly. There's absolutely no reason at all why we can't extend that to general elections. I think we put the turnout up massively by doing so. So, Ruth, that's the system that I was referring to. That, I think, would be a huge step in the right direction. Charles from Birmingham is ringing to give me the answer. Charles, good morning. Charles, hello? No, we haven't got Charles, but we have Michael from Muswell Hill on the line. Michael, good morning.
Oh, hi, Nigel. I'm not sure I have the answer, but possibly some suggestions. It seems to me that Parliament is dominated by men, and clearly that has led to the sort of atmosphere of machismo. I mean, our second house is called the House of Lords. Yep. I mean, the ladies don't even get a mention. So I think it's this atmosphere of machismo and the fact that there's so many sex scandals that have brought the Houses of Parliament into disrepute. Rather similar to your friend in America, how he has been dogged by sex scandals. In fact, he's admitted sexually assaulting women, and yet you, Nigel, you continue to support this man who 12 women have accused.
Well, I tell you what, Michael, if you want to talk about Donald Trump and you want to talk about Bill Clinton and all of that, we can do so. And we will be talking about Donald Trump from 11 until 12, because it's nearly exactly a year since that election on November the 8th last year. So that's not relevant to this. But are you saying to me, Michael, that if the percentage of women in Parliament increased further and the House of Lords was modernised, that would make Parliament a better place and we'd feel more in control of it?
Well, I think generally society is made up of 50% men and women. And I think the complete imbalance has left to this huge, huge sense of machismo, completely unrepresented, just like your friend, the American president. And we have to do something about it. We have to do something where it's okay to abuse women and become the leader of the free world.
No. Michael, I'm sorry. You've obviously got your hobby horse, and that's good for you, but it's not what we're discussing. Goodbye. Keith is calling from Stoke Newington. Keith, good morning.
Morning, Nigel. Look, Nigel, mustn't lose sight of the fundamental principles of our parliamentary system.
Yep.
For example, the House of Lords is the only institution in the world where a free man can participate in politics freely without having to follow a party line. And a party line can be classed as a dictatorship. And on that point, we've also got to remember that post-Oliver Cromwell, when he got rid of the monarchy by getting rid of Charles I, acted as Lord Protector and handed power to the MPs who became so corrupt, he then had to go and arrest them, throw him in Tower. He became Lord Protector. When he died, Parliament or the people realised they needed a check against to stop corrupt MPs. So they reinstated the monarchy with the sole jurisdiction to protect the people. So it's the monarch's responsibility to enforce these checks, and that's what we've still got to maintain, this freedom of the people to control, which is a point you're making.
Yeah.
But sorry?
No. I understand that, but Keith, the point about the House of Lords is, you talk about the independence of the people in the House of Lords. Every single person in Cameron's resignation honours, every single one of them backed the Remain campaign. There was nobody went there from the Leave campaign. And that's the kind of House of Lords that has been built up during the Blair and Cameron years. It is a representation of the metropolitan elite, and I think, frankly, the people of this country have lost all faith in it.
Yeah, no, I agree with that point. And Blair, in socialism, basically works on a dictatorship, and that was totally wrong for them to do that. And and that's manipulation of where the Queen, or the governing power, which is the Queen, should stop it. She's there to protect this manipulation, as you've just described, of MPs or
none of us know, Keith. None of us know what private conversations the Queen may or may not have had with these prime ministers over the course of the last few years. I understood why they wanted to abolish the hereditary peers, and we're left with 92 because it appeared to be totally out of date. But I think what we've replaced it with is far worse than it was when the majority of them were hereditaries. That's my feeling, Keith. I thank you, Keith, for your call. I think an elected Senate is the only possible way to go. My own suggestion would be that they can serve a 15-year term and one term only. That's my suggestion for how we do the upper house. Maybe Khalid in Edmonton has a view on that. Good morning.
Oh, morning, Nigel. I think we just need to get rid of career politicians. We need to get more experience in the House of Commons, so we need to get people from a wider variety of backgrounds, not just from Oxford, not just from the traditional universities. We need to get more ex-doctors, people from the city, people from social work, people who can genuinely input into policy. And I mean, the way you do that, this is going to be controversial, but the way you do that is to increase MP salaries massively. I'm sorry, but 75,000, is it? Is that how much?
Yeah, well, yeah, but Khalid,
75,000 is not going to get anywhere. As no one worth his salt who's got any experience in the private sector is going to take a job for 75,000.
I do understand that argument, Khalid. I do understand. It's often said that young professionals in their 30s who are very good in their fields won't go into politics because they'd be taking a big pay cut. But even if you up the salaries, if the two big parties are still in charge, effectively, of who your candidate is, constituency by constituency, then you will get no change on the current group of politicians we've got. I made a comment earlier about all these allegations, these sexual allegations. Most of these people being accused, the general public have never even heard of them. And I think, Khalid, if you went to AV+, the system I talked about a few minutes ago, other political parties would start to win more seats in Parliament, and then you would see a bigger range of backgrounds.
But don't you think people who we want to represent us would just be put off because they just wouldn't be able to support their family? I mean, I can see your point. There is definitely a point there in terms of political parties being able to choose candidates. There's definitely an argument there. But ultimately, this is about economics.
Right. Well, do you know what, Khalid? Khalid, if Brexit goes through properly, and if our Parliament is genuinely sovereign and in charge and responsible and directly accountable under a system where we can sack MPs that are wrong-uns, we've got more choice at election time, then I wouldn't mind them being paid more. But not until that moment, is my view. You're listening to the Sunday edition of the Nigel Farage Show, exclusively on LBC. It's 10:46. I want to bring some faith back into our political system, and I want voters to feel that they're in charge again. I think we need really serious reform, and I'm asking you for your suggestions. Chrissy says to me on Twitter, greed should be kicked out, no more spin, limit expenses, and no free bars at work. There are no free bars, Chrissy. They do actually have to buy their drinks in the House of Commons and the Lords. They may not be the most expensive prices, but they do, and it is subsidised, but they do have to buy them. And I think the point is, maybe that the argument, and we've seen a bit of it today, is that if there's less alcohol knocking around Westminster, there may be fewer sexual indiscretions that take place. That is an argument that is being heard out there today. John from Somerset says, I'd make every voter take their passport and driver's licence to vote. Well, that would certainly stop the vote early, vote often phenomenon. I thought it was disgraceful after the election. The number of people on websites, students saying they were students, boasting they'd voted twice in the general election. Yep, that's something that needs to be looked at. Your suggestions for reform are great, but how do we get them to happen? Because the government will never want them. Well, the government, Elaine, never wanted an EU referendum, but they were forced into that. If enough people want change and are prepared to stand up and say it, you can get it. Corbyn would love the 16-year-olds to vote. He is their cult leader. 21 years of age would be my preferred choice, says David. But Stephen on Facebook disagrees wildly with that and says that they should be able to vote because they're able to fight for their country at that age. Well, they're not. You've got to be 18 to fight for the country. Positive suggestion here. Banning Farage from politics. That'd really help, wouldn't it? Now, I mean, that wouldn't that? That's a great Twitter suggestion. That would really help hugely. Actually, I tell you what, whether you agree with me or disagree with me, one thing I did manage to do was to bring people into the voting system who hadn't voted, in some cases, ever in their lives. I'd like to see a lot more people voting. Dawn says bring in PR and compulsory voting. I don't support compulsory voting. I think it's your choice whether you go out and exercise that vote or not. That is part of your freedom, part of your liberty to make that decision. But it's a healthier country if more people engage in the process and vote. The AV Plus voting system, I'm convinced, would do that. Louise is calling me from Islington. Louise, good morning.
Oh, good morning, Nigel. I am such an admirer of your voice. I love listening to you.
Well, that's very kind of you, Louise. Thank you.
I like the way you sell things as well. Unfortunately, I've got a couple of things that I would like to discuss with you. And one of it, you said that the Parliament or the politicians are not responsible enough. Now, where do they get their information from? Their unfiltered information, or is it all filtered information upon which they act?
No, they make their own minds up, Louise. I mean, you know, they get briefs that are given to them by researchers and from political parties, and there's a whip that is given to them every week telling them what's coming up to vote and how they should vote. So a lot of things are given to them, but hey, they're all grown-ups and they're free to source information from wherever they want.
Yes, I know, but there is a serious lack of information, and it is actually quite biased. And I just feel that if it were more balanced, that would help.
Well, Louise, I would say, just in final answer to that one point, that is determined by the quality of people that we have in Parliament. If you have quality people in Parliament, they will have inquiring minds. They will source their own forms of what they see as the truth. Sorry, Louise, your second point.
I'm 100% with you on that, 100%. The second thing I just wanted to ask you, you had this voting system that you're suggesting, with two separate pieces of paper. What happens if one polling station doesn't supply one set of papers, and then they only can vote one thing?
No, because that will be the instruction. Is that every there will be two sets of ballot papers for every election. There'll be two boxes, with clearly marked ballot papers, one to go in the black box and one to go in the white box or the blue box or the green box or whatever it is. So no, I'm not worried about that, Louise, at all. And as I say, we are effectively using a variant of that system already for the London Assembly, for the Welsh Assembly and for the Scottish Parliament. So already that principle that you have a first-past-the-post representative and a top-up list, it's already pretty well established throughout the UK. I know the Conservative Party have never ever wanted this. The Labour Party don't want it. But I do think, frankly, for millions of people, if you're a Tory living in a safe Labour area, or a socialist, a Corbynite living in, I don't know, somewhere in West Sussex, the incentives to go and vote simply aren't great, Louise.
But you see, I quite agree with you. The only thing is, I heard at some stage, I'm not sure it was in England, but they were running out of paper to vote. So that if that doesn't happen like that, then that's fine. Can I just have one other question?
Go on then, very quickly.
Yeah, you are the only person that actually said anything about the referendum. That actually really the rest of the politicians or anybody was useless. People were just not informed. There was nothing that they really any of the major points was made to people. It was done like Trump, who just went to the individual groups and said, you can have more fish, you don't have to pay so much for that, you can have the coal now, you can do this. Only those bits were pointed out, and it did not give any. I know it is such a big subject. To leave it to the poor individual to make a decision on such a big thing is enormous.
Well, Louise, all I will say to you is that exercise in direct democracy via the referendum produced a result that shocked the establishment and proved they were wrong in terms of their thinking. Just for that, it was worthwhile. My last caller on the subject is going to be Jordan, who's calling from Manchester. Jordan, good morning.
Hello, Nigel.
So, what needs to happen?
I kind of agree with you on this. I think there needs to be serious reforms. I think there's some, though, I think you probably wouldn't agree with, though. So I do want proportional representation, and ideally I do like single transferable vote, but I do understand it can kind of cut the link between the constituency and an MP. So
yeah, I mean, obviously Northern Ireland is using a fair bit of that, but yeah. I mean, the reason I suggested AV Plus was I think you do keep that link, and that's considered to be an important point by electors, Jordan.
Yeah, well, I think as a compromise, because we mentioned about the House of Lords as well.
Yeah,
it could be, other forms of government do have upper houses and editing houses, so perhaps first past the post or AV Plus is there. However, a true proportional representation for an upper house or an editing house rather than the House of Lords, so that could be truly proportional to the amount of votes that a party has got. I do want the lowering age down. I mean, you made quite a decent point in regards to they couldn't become an MP themselves. Mm-hmm. However, obviously, 16 and 17-year-olds couldn't vote for an MP, but they could marry that MP and also have sex with that MP. Equally, Cat Smith, Labour MP, did make a really valid point, actually, in the fact that if you're a 16 and 17-year-old Tory member, you're in a case where you could actually potentially vote for the next Prime Minister in a leadership election, but you couldn't vote for your local MP.
Yeah, no. I mean, of course, look, there are anomalies, Jordan, with this all over. My one big principle is you shouldn't be able to vote in an election unless you're eligible to be a candidate. And at national level, I think that applies, and I just don't think that having 16-year-olds standing as members of Parliament makes sense. That's all.
Yeah. Also, where maybe I might go a step further than you, is I'd want presidential elections.
Well, we almost have, Jordan, we almost have them now, because actually, when everyone's voting in the general election, they're either voting for Corbyn or against Corbyn or for May or against May. We've almost become presidential. And most MPs, the votes they get in their constituencies, they themselves, their personal vote is now absolutely tiny. So you would like a big change towards prime ministerial elections, yeah?
Yes, also, as you mentioned, open primaries, or, as a party position, I would like mandatory elections of all MPs.
Do you know what, Jordan? Do you know what? If we had open primaries, then people really would be able, in their own town or district, to get the representative for their party that they wanted. At the moment, the central parties have way, way too much power. Jordan, you're a true radical, and I thank you for your call. Now, 1 year ago, the world was in shock. It was November the 8th, and Donald Trump had won the US presidential election. He defied the critics and the polls to become the 45th president of the USA. 1 year on, since that election, I want you to tell me, how's he doing? If you think he's saying the right things and behaving as a president should, text me on 84850. Perhaps you think he's a total disaster, in which case you can text to 84850. You can tweet using the hashtag Farage and LBC at LBC. You can watch me on Facebook. It's Sunday morning and we're live from London next.